again. Welcome to PAVE's 82nd panel conversation. Today's panel is called What Do AVs Mean for Ride Sharing? Obviously, ride sharing has become a big part of our transportation system in the last few decades, and we wanted to have a conversation about how the ride sharing system changes as AV technology enters the scene. My name is Tara Andringa, and I'm the Executive Director of PAVE. I wanted to take a moment to introduce our guests, and then we'll get started with the conversation. First, we have Bert Kaufman, who's the head of public policy and regulatory affairs at Zoox. Welcome, Bert.
Thanks so much, Tara.
Next, we have Sergio Avedian, who is a senior contributor with the Rideshare Guy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
And we have Mollie Cohen D'Agostino, who is the policy director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. Thanks for joining us, Mollie.
Thank you.
Wanted to start today. We have a really interesting group of panelists who are doing fascinating things in the rideshare space. And so I wanted to first just take a moment and let them each talk for a moment about their organization and how they're involved in ride sharing. Sergio, could we start with you? Could you just describe the Rideshare Guy and what it is you all do?
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Sergio Avedian. I'm the senior contributor for the Rideshare Guy. Rideshare Guy was founded in about 2015 by Harry Campbell, who was an now ex-aerospace engineer at Boeing. So at the Rideshare Guy, we have three different channels. We have a blog that most of our contributors write articles for. We have a YouTube channel that is strictly discussing rideshare subjects, or mostly gig economy subjects, really. And then Harry has been religiously doing his podcast for the last 6 years. He just hit his 200th, actually, which is amazing. So that's what we do. We're basically there for the drivers to be informed with the latest changes on the apps, new companies entering the space, obviously, as far as the gig economy is concerned, and anything and everything about the gig economy you can find on the Rideshare Guy. Fantastic.
And Bert, could you just tell us a little bit about Zoox?
Yeah, and again, it's great to be here and see everybody. As Tara said, I'm with Zoox. Zoox was founded in 2014 to help cities solve problems around reducing road safety risks and congestion and pollution. So we are developing, and we've been developing since 2014, a fully autonomous battery electric vehicle optimized for ride sharing in cities. And then, eventually building out the rideshare network so we can help people move from point A to point B within dense urban environments.
Fantastic. And Mollie, lastly, can you tell us how you're involved in the ride sharing ecosystem?
Sure. So, hi, I'm Mollie D'Agostino. I'm the policy director at both the Institute of Transportation Studies, the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, which actually includes UC Davis, Berkeley, LA, and Irvine, which is a new role, and I wear many hats, and also at the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy at UC Davis. So we've come into this space from the perspective of understanding the travel behavior impacts of ride hailing, and also understanding the trends in how that affects travel beyond those who choose to use these services. We're also very interested in automation, and we've done a lot of work surrounding the Three Revolutions, which was a book published in 2018 focusing on sharing, electrification, and automation, and how those three revolutions together can yield better outcomes for communities. So I'll stop there and looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Me too. Okay, Sergio, I want to go back to you, and we're going to start really high level. I assume most people joining us today have ridden in a rideshare vehicle or used a rideshare app. But just so we can compare, can you give us an overview of what the typical rideshare experience is like right now in a major city with a human driver?
Sure. I've been a driver on both platforms as well as a passenger for the last 6 years now, since 2016. I don't drive as much as I used to, just for the fact, the economics doesn't really work out at this point. And I got 2 kids, of course. But I look at rideshare as a driver in three phases. So one would be getting the request from a passenger that is sent to you by Uber or Lyft. So on Uber platform, we have about 6 seconds as a driver to figure out if that's a profitable ride for us and respond, accept the ride or decline the ride. On Lyft is about 12 seconds. And then obviously we have to go pick up the person to take them to where they're, asked to go. So for me, that first phase, I think, as far as rideshare driver is concerned, is probably the most dangerous and the most important one, just for the fact that the passenger is waiting, and we have to, in most cases, I drive in Los Angeles, so Los Angeles being as spread out as it is, but pickup, I think, for me, is the most complicated part of rideshare as a driver. Just for the fact that when you do get there, you may have to wait for 4, 5, 6 minutes because Uber allows the passenger 5 minutes to get to the car. About half of the passengers are not ready to go when you show up as a driver. Well, once you show up, you have parking problems. You may have to be double parked or park on red. Or once you arrive, even if the passenger is ready, you may be on the south side of the street, but the passenger's on the north side of the street. Now you have to make a U-turn, mostly illegal, of course. So that's the most dangerous and the stressful part of a rideshare driver's pickup. The second part, obviously, they get in the car, you exchange your, pleasantries, and then, they're on either talkative or not. They're on the back seat, either, flipping through their social media pages and checking their likes or whatever they're doing, or conducting some business. That's the easy part. You're just going to go follow the directions, by either Google Maps or Waze or whatever you choose to use. And then the third part, obviously, is the drop off. So drop off is definitely not as complicated as pickup because it takes a lot less time because they're ready to get out of your car anyway. If it's in morning rush hour, they have appointments or whatever they have, they can't wait to get out of the car. If it's late at night, from a restaurant, you drop them off at a house, it takes about 20 seconds for them to get out of the car. But for me, out of those three phases, pickup and on the way to pickup is the most complicated one.
That's fascinating. And so many things you mentioned, I think most passengers don't think about at all because it seems so natural. Those are all fascinating insights. And then, Bert, I'm curious if you can just give us talk about a little bit from with an autonomous vehicle for a passenger who takes a ride in a Zoox vehicle. How is that ride similar or different to what Sergio just described?
Yeah, so first a little show and tell to pull out the prop that's behind me on the screen. That is the vehicle that we have developed and that we're actually developing to help move people from point A to point B wonderfully in cities. It is not yet on public roads, but what Uber and Lyft have taught us is that there is demand for this kind of on-demand app-enabled mobility really anywhere. And so the question for Zoox when we got started was, can we develop the same thing, but develop an autonomous vehicle for it? And our philosophy behind developing that vehicle was to build a vehicle that was bespoke to a ride-sharing duty cycle, not a conventional car that is basically optimized and engineered to sit parked and idle for 96% of its life. But the vehicle behind us is a really unique state-of-the-art vehicle that's optimized around the AI system. Has a really big battery, so it doesn't have to recharge. It's obviously battery electric, so it's not no tailpipe emissions in cities. But the concept is quite similar to what Sergio described. These things are moving around in the city over the course of the day and night, responding to customer requests to move people around, to pick people up and to drop people off. A lot of our focus to date has been on collecting actual miles on the road, because there's a lot of complex things that happen with other agents, other vehicles, other road users on the road that the system needs to train on. But Sergio described the dance that you do at pickup and drop off, and it is a dance, and there's a lot that goes into that, and that's a focus area of ours for the future, because we're not going to be able to serve customers if you can't pick them up and drop them off.
Absolutely. Bert and Sergio both gave a really good overview of the customer experience, but kind of want to take a step back, actually. And Mollie, I'm curious if you can just talk about the broader societal impacts and mobility trends that have led to the rise of ride-sharing services.
Yeah, happy to. So, of us at, we love to take a step back here in academia, but I'm not a professor, so I'm representing researchers. My role is to ensure that the research has impact and public policy can be well informed by the best research. And so, but like you mentioned trend, both you're curious about trends and about impacts. And I think that, of course, so I'll tackle trends first and impacts second. So first, I think, that ride hailing got pretty darn popular before the pandemic, right? But about somewhere between 18 and 21% for denser metro areas in terms of riders who had used the service within a month. That's pretty significant. Certainly, still overall a very small share of overall vehicle miles for the whole country. But those numbers aren't great. Under 2% is what we estimate for overall vehicle miles traveled in ride-hail vehicles. So it's pretty small share of overall travel. But it's really interesting to think about who is using the services, right? And we knew that the earliest Uber riders were the more affluent users, but there is something of a double peak with low-income users really relying on the service. Interestingly, a survey that we did across many cities across the U.S. during the pandemic showed that low-income riders were the most resilient to ride-hail users, we know that there's a lot of reasons for that. Many may have been essential workers or living in areas where public transit was not reliable, and ride-hail serves as a great backstop for that, right? So we know that's some of the trends. I think moving quickly to impacts, I think it's obviously this is a small conversation, so we can't get into all the nitty-gritty, but we know that on the high level, in denser areas where ride-hailing might be substituting for public transit, for biking, for walking, you may be actually adding greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled when you replace those trips, and that could have a societal impact, right? So that's just a sort of simplistic picture. Of course, it's much more fine-grained when you look at the sort of differences between denser urban areas with higher quality transit, suburban areas with some mixed availability of transit, and rural areas, right? Which have very low availability of ride-hail service and low transit use. So the important thing to think about in those settings is the deadheading. What Sergio mentioned, that first part of his trip that he hates the most, is also the part that is causing the most emissions, right? Because moving between passengers is not time that is done by a driver in their own car, right? You don't move between neighborhoods before you go on a trip. You just get in your vehicle, right? So the reality is that ride-hail vehicles are going to produce that travel, that what we call deadheading, that happens between the two paying customers. And right now, and that contributes to a lot of extra miles and extra emissions that are associated with ride-hailing. So the big question, I think, for AVs is how do we reduce that? How do we create a system that can be more efficient and reduce that impact, not just on emissions, but also on congestion? And we know that to some extent, ride-hailing has had congestive impacts on some of our denser cities. There's studies in San Francisco that show that to be the case. Of course, there's a lot of factors at play there, right? And really the fact that people are choosing ride-hailing vehicles instead of public transit or biking and walking are a reflection of the market, right? And if you price things in such a way that there's a preferred alternative, people will choose that, right? So if you have a public transit time cost, right? Because we're not just paying money, we also pay in time. If it takes too long to take public transit, in many such circumstances, people will choose driving and ride-hailing where parking or parking costs may be high, and other deterrents that make ride-hailing preferable to driving, even though it's quite a bit more expensive per mile for the user. So all that to say, obviously we can't get into all the details, but those are some of the trends and impacts that we've seen. And of course, there's much still to be seen.
Fascinating stuff there. And as you said, there were about 10 different questions I would love to dig into there. Sergio, I do want to go back to you though about the driver's experience. And one question I wanted to ask is how workers in the gig economy responded to the increasing demand for rideshare. Then also wanted to pull in a question we got from the audience, which is what implications will AVs bring for the independent contract drivers?
Sure. So before I answer those two questions, let me touch up on something Mollie was talking about.
Please.
You know, with greenhouse gases and a lot of dead miling or deadheading is concerned. So Uber and Lyft, you know, have to have enough driver supply to just satisfy the demand, right? So during the pandemic, obviously the demand collapsed for rideshare, but other things came around that we'll talk about in a second. So, you know, Uber and Lyft has to put out this supply out there. So when she was talking about deadheading between two passengers, there is also another part of this that Uber and Lyft have to oversaturate the marketplace with drivers because look, they both do the same thing. It's a commoditized business, right? What's the most important two things for the passenger? It's pickup ETA and the fare, how much it costs to get from, because they're both going to do the same thing. There's nothing different between Uber and Lyft. So the utilization rate for a driver, a personal utilization rate, has truly collapsed over the last 5 or 6 years. Like when I first started to drive in 2016, I could hardly turn my app off fast enough to take a break because there would be request after request after request. So now when I look at my passenger app, there is 8 Uber cars and 8 Lyft cars at every corner of Los Angeles. So why is that? Well, Uber wants to obviously get that passenger in the car, and so does Lyft. So when I order a ride, I look at two things. I look at who's going to pick me up faster, because then I'm going to get to my destination faster, and which one is cheaper. So to me, you know, that is adding quite a bit because the driver's utilization factor, my personal utilization factor, right before the pandemic in 2019 was down to like 45%, meaning I only had a passenger in the car with the wheels turning 45% of the time versus 95% of the time in 2016. Wow. Right? So that's something we need to discuss maybe at a later date. So the question that you asked, how, you know, the Rideshare guy would do a whole bunch of surveys, yearly surveys, basically. So what we have found out that 85% of Rideshare drivers quit in less than 6 to 8 months. So Uber and Lyft have this problem that they have to basically replenish their driver base every 6 to 8 months. Now, if you ask any business person, what's your turnover? And if they say, oh, it's 85%, but we're quite happy with it, that business is doomed to fail. I mean, you can't have an 85% turnover, while Uber and Lyft does. So to me, the important thing is what are drivers doing? Look, there's over 2 million drivers in the US on Uber and Lyft platforms. And Uber and Lyft obviously have not run out of drivers yet, so somebody's always there to pick up the slack. And my answer to that is, you know, drivers are there for 6 to 8 months, but then the 80-20 rule applies when it comes to rideshare, like in any other business. So there's 20% of the drivers that are full-time drivers. They're the true grinders, right? They do 100, 200 rides a week, you know, that's their full-time gig, and they do 80% of the rides. And then you have 80% of the drivers who are part-timers, maximum 10 hours a week, and they pick up the rest of the rides. So 20% picks up 80% of the rides, and 80% pick up 20% of the rides. So my conclusion is, you know, drivers are a tough bunch. Look, the Uber and Lyft is not short of finding drivers because they put out massive bonuses, and they have chosen to go that path. They spend billions in marketing, in sign-up incentives, all kinds of things, for them to onboard new drivers, because when 85% quit, I mean, every 6 to 8 months, where are you going to find, you know, another 1.5 million drivers, right? You can't just pull them out of the hat. So, and then the second part of the question to answer is, as I said, you know, rideshare has become a part-time gig for a lot of people, or in between jobs gigs, you know, whatever you want to call it. It's something people choose to do. Nobody's putting a gun to anybody's head to do this. And then during the pandemic, when the pandemic hit and rideshare numbers collapsed, you know, a lot of drivers in the Uber app, if you were driving for Uber, they pivoted. They pivoted to food delivery. They pivoted to Instacart. They pivoted to Postmates. They pivoted to DoorDash, right? So, you know, they said, well, I'm not going to risk my health driving people around, even during the pandemic, although some were still doing it, you know, driving nurses or doctors around from hospital to hospital, a lot of them pivoted. And what they discovered is that truly they will make less money doing food delivery or grocery delivery, but their health is not at risk. Also, they're going to put less miles on their cars. So now, coming out of the pandemic, let's say May, June, July, Uber and Lyft faced a massive driver shortage because a lot of people had pivoted to other gig jobs. And they put out, we know that Uber put out $250 million to attract drivers back onto the platform. And they successfully did so. So I wrote an article November or so last year. The oversaturation was exactly what it was in 2019. So with the pandemic unemployment assistance ending for gig economy workers, the federal assistance, they were all back on the road again because they have to put food on the table. They have to do something to make money. So to me, drivers are a tough bunch. They pivot, they do whatever they need to do. But on the other hand, the oversaturation problem is something is really, really important for most rideshare drivers, especially me.
For sure. No, interesting points. Bert, wanted we got several questions from the audience on the issue of scaling. And so wanted to talk to you about how you all are tackling the challenge of scaling your technology, and then some similar questions. We got one audience member asked, do you anticipate that Zoox vehicles will become available as part of a mobility as service fleet owned and operated by another company? And yeah, like another person asked, since Uber and Fleet don't own their cars at the moment, how will owning a large fleet to reach scale affect their business model? Just kind of curious if you can talk about Zoox, your approach to scaling the technology.
Yeah, those are all really great and thoughtful questions. I should start off by saying, today we are still testing our technology on streets in San Francisco, Seattle, Las Vegas. As I said, the vehicle behind me, we have actually not deployed on public roads as of yet, but it's a unique vehicle. And I think one of the unique characteristics of it is the fact that there'll be, hundreds of these around a city, and the product experience will actually be pretty similar throughout. So there's not going to be a mystery for the customer about what they're going to get when they get into a Zoox. And that's something that we're really very intent on. In terms of scaling and how you scale these, I think a lot of cities and city officials look at us through the lens of what they believe happened to cities in 2010 and 2011, when basically Uber and Lyft did flip a switch and all of a sudden started to see this matching that Sergio described. And they're like, whoa, these are thousands of vehicles on the road. Where do they come from? They're taking up more space. Our line to cities is that, we understand that, but it's going to be a little bit different with automated vehicles. For one, it's going to be a much more gradual approach. Even before we launch in a city, we've got to spend time mapping it, ensuring that our system can safely navigate around it. Because we do imagine, and part of our business model is owning and operating the fleet, building out the charging and maintenance infrastructure to support that fleet. And so, yes, while we're app enabled, it is, there are similarities to what Uber and Lyft do, but there are also similarities to what we know a conventional taxi cab business to be when we think about our fleet as well. But it is going to be a gradual approach into cities as this technology comes to market.
Thank you. And that's the perfect segue to the next question I wanted to ask you about, Mollie, is that transition period. It's going to be a gradual shift. So when we think about that period between the current technology and automated services that are available in the future, where AV ride sharing options are more commonplace, how can we best facilitate that transition in a way that maximizes the benefits of both systems?
Well, it's a great question. Let's hope we can do it. So it's not happening overnight, as Bert mentioned. And I think as Sergio mentioned, the labor transition is going to be somewhat gradual, which should ease the transition. I think that a couple things to mention on the labor side. I think we know that automation is a much bigger picture than ride hailing. As we mentioned, this is, automation has come to manufacturing, ports, warehousing, and there's been public policy responses, right? There's been the U.S. Department of Labor has funds to help workers in transition. And right now, I think what needs to be done is to anticipate automation and the effects that it might have on drivers, is to make sure that those programs include those drivers, right? Because those programs tend to only capture folks that are full-time employees. And so the question is, how can we reform those systems so we make sure that drivers aren't affected? But I think on the broader picture about how the automation will affect the broader marketplace, I think we know prices matter, and prices will affect our decisions. So the question is, how do we price, if we accept that some externalities exist for the cost of driving now, how do we change that picture? How do we capture some of those externalities and make driving cheaper, right? And that's the promise of AVs, that they may be able to reduce overall costs per mile such that we can still help, we can still have programs and funds that could help offset some of the problems that they may create. So that might mean subsidies for low-income riders so they can use the services. That might mean subsidies for greenhouse gas emissions. That might set subsidies, fees on greenhouse gas emissions. I don't want to use the tax word 2 days before tax day, but obviously there have to be some financial drivers that can push the industry in the right direction, and that will be up to policymakers to help do that and steer the automated vehicle sector in a sustainable and equitable way.
Yeah, really good.
And I mean, if I can just jump on this thing that Mollie had said, right? I think pricing will be a big factor in this, and that will ultimately be what drives the consumer to determine which mode to take. We look at the cost of owning a vehicle today and then compare that to ride sharing, and then compare that to what it could be under autonomous mobility. And, it's quite different. I also think that, this is something that cities will want, because it's, cleaner, it would ostensibly be safer. If I could put a plug in to a future of the commuting survey, our first future of the commuting survey that we came out with last week at Zoox. 65% of those that we surveyed thought that their city would be better off with access to a fully autonomous mobility service. So it's not like they come to that conclusion without having the experience of ride sharing or public transit, or sitting in traffic in their own car. And that's what I think makes it pretty exciting for the future of this space.
I saw your survey, and yeah, so some fascinating findings for sure. Sergio, but then another question is about, we got some questions too about labor issues, and will some people lose jobs as a result of automation and rideshare services? Do you have any comments about that?
Sure. I mean, look, we could discuss the labor issue for another 16 hours here. As we know, Uber and Lyft, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, misclassify their workers. We're not truly independent contractors. We're just run by a bunch of algorithms to go from point A to point B. I'm in California. We know what happened in California with Prop 22 and AB 5. Same thing is happening in Massachusetts now. Obviously, look, both of these companies, rideshare companies, don't want their drivers to be employees because their business model wouldn't survive. Well, when Bert was mentioning, and then you had another question about the economics of the issue, the business model, hasn't produced any results for Uber and Lyft. I mean, Uber and Lyft have not made a red cent yet since their inception. Yeah, they could say, EBITDA profitability, but EBITDA is in the eye of the beholder, is not GAAP profitability. So to me, it's like, is this business ever going to be profitable? And on the same front, labor issue is a major part of the equation, just for the fact that if you make these 2 million drivers your employees, these companies will not survive. That's why they're fighting so hard to keep us as independent contractors. And we are not independent contractors. Look, if I don't know what the job is, and if I don't know what I'm going to get paid, maybe most of your viewers as passengers don't know this, but I don't know where the passenger is going before I pick them up. So if you called an electrician tomorrow and say, hey, I have a job for you, and they say, great, what is it? And you say, no, I'm not going to tell you until you get here. Well, that guy's going to hang up on you. So to me, true independent contractor will be able to set their own price, we can pass on these inflationary pressures that we're feeling over the last few months to the customer. A driver doesn't have any of those things, right? So basically, freedom, flexibility. Yes, you can turn the app on and off whenever you want, but then it's not true independent contractor. So labor issue, again, like I said on the previous answer, if 85% are quitting, you don't have a labor issue. You're just going to find new blood. I mean, that's all there is to it. You just do, hard marketing, push your freedom and flexibility rhetoric, and get more drivers into the system until you run out of drivers. And then hopefully AVs will kick in. And then, I'm not worried about the labor issue that much, because there is no labor issue because we're not employees.
Yeah, absolutely. And unbelievably, we are out of time. As always, it goes way too fast. And like you all said, I feel like we could talk about all of these things for 3 more days. Would love to at some point kind of do a part B and continue this conversation and dive a little more deeply into some of these issues. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Absolutely fascinating perspectives.
Yeah.
Excited to talk to you all, and to our audience, thank you for joining us. You can get more information at our website, pavecampaign.org, or on social media at pavecampaign. Thank you again to our panelists, and we'll see you next week. To the audience,